Hi, welcome to all of you here today. And it's really nice to see known and familiar faces from last year's program, and it's very thrilling to see new faces as well. On behalf of the Oakwood Cemetery Project, I'm really honored to welcome you all to today's event. My name is Pranati Dewakar, and today, as you all know, we're here to celebrate the life and music of Mr. Eddie Harris. A year ago, we held a very special program called Sacred Grounds Gospel Sounds in honor of the gospel musicians who are buried here at Oakwood Cemetery. For this program, Professor Adam Green, who you'll hear from in just a little while, led a gospel walking tour right here at the cemetery. And during this tour, we walked to the northeast corner of the cemetery where some of Chicago's greatest musicians are interred. It includes Thomas A. Dorsey, Albertina Walker, Otis Clay, the Staples family, and of course, the great Eddie Harris. So the idea for today's program was really sparked a year ago when we realized that naturally the next chapter is a celebration of Eddie Harris and his trailblazing innovations in jazz and his groundbreaking contributions to Chicago's rich musical landscape. I won't attempt to introduce or summarize the multitudes contained by Eddie Harris, and I'll leave that task to those who will speak through the course of the program. But what I will say is that this multi-hyphenate saxophonist, musician, composer, innovator, and thinker is commemorated at his gravesite with a simple and poignant epitaph, which reads, "To be a successful musician, you must first become a successful human being." Today, I hope you'll join us in celebrating not only the musical legacy of this Chicago-born legend, but also his place in the hearts of his family, friends, collaborators, and those who've had the great fortune of knowing him. And with this year marking 30 years since he passed on, we take today to remember Eddie Harris as a musician, innovator, creative collaborator, but also a friend, a father, a husband, and an inspiration to so many who came after him. Listen Here, which is the title for today's program, comes from a track on one of his most renowned albums. We chose this title as an invitation to all of you gathered here today to listen right here on the grounds where he's laid to eternal rest, to the immortal reverberations of the life and music of the electrifying Eddie Harris. On that note, I would also like to welcome Mr. Eddie Harris's family that are also so graciously here with us today. And if at any point you would like to share, yes, please give it up. Thank you, Ms. Yvonne Harris, for taking the time to come all the way. It really means so much to all of us at the Oakwood Cemetery Project. If at any point you would like to share recollections, memories, words with us, we would be so honored. But first, I'd like to invite someone who's been here at Oakwood Cemetery for over 30 years, and that's Miss Pamela Shine. She's also had a close and personal relationship with the Harris family for several of those years, so she's going to talk a little bit about how Eddie Harris came to be here. So please put your hands together and welcome Miss Pamela Shine.
Okay, first of all blessings to the Lord. He gave him his great talent that he is sharing with the world, and even after death, his music goes on. So I was very, very happy to be a part of this extraordinary process to get him to his final resting place. And it started out that he was at another cemetery. He started out at Evergreen Cemetery. As I understand, he was moved a couple of times. And finally, he got here to Oakwood Cemetery, and we entombed him downstairs. And he was in a crypt there. And I would see Miss Harris from time to time. She would come to the counter, and she just wasn't happy with where her husband was finally laid to rest. She felt he deserved better. And so I listened, so I work in the pre-planning department, so I'm thinking, oh, well, okay, well. But we started carrying a a specific thing in like 98 that I was just getting used to. It's called a private estate mausoleum, where you purchase your lot of land and then you design your building, you put it on top of the ground and you make it your own. You make it personal, your own. So as I was listening to her and they were taking the work order to kind of address, a few of the issues that were important to her, I walked up to the front and I introduced myself and I said, well, Miss Harris, if he's not where you would like for him to be, we can move him. They do move people. In scripture, Joseph said, hey, when you all go, leave Egypt, you take my bones with you. So people move all the time. I got the book, I showed it to her, and she said, that's what he needs. That's exactly what my husband deserves. And she was just such a woman. She wanted something special for her husband to go down in history. Also, she didn't like the idea that necessarily he was inside the mausoleum. I said, well, with this private estate, people can drive by, they can visit him, and they can drive on. They can sit in their car, they can listen to some jazz, listen to some gospel, or whatever their preference is, and spend time with him. And she loved that idea. So she said, so we picked out the color, which is royal sable, and there is only one other mausoleum here. I've done over 50 private estates. There is only one other here that's in that particular granite, which comes from Cold Spring, Minnesota. And royal sable is also the color that the Johnson family selected for their mausoleum. So there are only 2 mausoleums with that color. And I wanted to make it special because I felt he deserved something special. And well, Lolita and I, we got together. I was running past your mom, Miss Sarah, and I said, I envisioned some musical notes on the front of his mausoleum. I said, do you think you can give me some sheet music and I can replicate that on the front of the panel, on the front of the mausoleum? And she said, yeah, I'm sure I could. And Lolita, she just jumped on in there. And I asked, well, what was his most favorite song? And we talked about Cold Duck and a few other songs, but she said Freedom Jazz Dance was something he was really well known for. So I sent it to the vendor, to the graphic art department in Minnesota, and they pulled together what they wanted, what they envisioned the notes to be. At first, they were a little busy. There were notes all over, and you couldn't see his name. And I said, no, that's not going to work. So we decided on just getting 2 stanzas of music notes, one at the top, one at the bottom. And then I said, for the epithet, please put something more than rest in peace, in loving memory, the regular things that people put for a verse on the front. And she thought about it. And what came out of her mouth was, to be a successful musician, you must first become a successful human being. I said, all right, well, she put that there. And we talked about extending it and adding steps in a patio. And so she put there loving husband and wife. And I thought that was really apropos for, for them both, that she held him special even after death. And, how many people can say that as a couple that you're bonded together like that? But Miss Sarah was really serious about making sure that he had something nice, and we did. We finally accomplished something nice for him, something special, something unique, something different. I often, just on the spur, will give a tour here at Oakwood. It's not that, it takes time of the office, of me servicing families, things like that. But I love giving a tour when I have time to do it, and doing genealogy as well, because we're the oldest cemetery in Chicago, February 12th, 1853. We're pre-Civil War. So just giving people the history. So one day I was out with Miles Davis' nephew. His Miles Davis' sister is interred here. She's buried over by Peaceful Shores, by Peaceful Lake, under Wilburn. And I was just taking him through the cemetery. And when we came up the road where Eddie Harris is entombed, I said, I'm giving him, the different people that are buried there. Even before we got to the crypt, because he's a jazz musician as well, he jumped out of the car with his phone. I said, where are you going? He said, yeah, you can, and he got excited. Oh, those are the notes and you can play it. And so he took a picture of it and held it in his phone, and I don't know what he did with it afterwards, but that's what Miles Davis' nephew, we were so excited to see that he was honored like that something that had to do with what he contributed to the world was being etched in stone forever, and it will be forever. The cemetery is almost 200 years old. If Jesus tarries for another 200 years, people will always see that part of him, part of his legacy and everything. They will see that on his crypt front. So I wanted it to be personal. We unfortunately lost her in 25, Miss Sarah. I wasn't here. I was out sick. Otherwise, I would have been here. I really would have. But he was put away. She was put away nicely, deservingly. And I'll be really happy for those of you who haven't seen his private estate mausoleum to see it. It's special. It's on the corner. It's in kind of an isolated place, a calm place. But it's something that's deserving of him, something that is deserving. So that's all I have to say. And, men out here, you should get a wife like that, Miss Sarah, because Miss Sarah was on it. She couldn't rest until she got that project done, and he was in a fitting resting place. He was moved like 4 times. Excuse me. That's my phone. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shine. When I was setting up for this event, Ms. Pamela told me about this story, and I thought all of you should also hear it. So thank you for sharing. Next up, we have a conversation about the musical impact of Eddie Harris. And for this conversation, we have 2 of the foremost scholars of music in Chicago to speak about Eddie Harris and his contributions. Our first speaker is Travis A. Jackson, who's a professor in the University of Chicago's Department of Music and director of undergraduate studies. He's the author of Blown the Blues Away, Performance and Music on the New York Jazz Scene, and his scholarship examines the intersection of musical composition, recording, and distribution with their reception and embeddedness in culture, society, race, history, and geography. Our next speaker is Adam Green, who is a professor in both the University of Chicago's Department of History and the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity. He's the author of Selling the Race, Culture and Community in Black Chicago from 1940 to 1955. And his scholarship offers insights on modern US history, African American history, urban history, comparative racial politics, and cultural politics. There could not be 2 more perfect interlocutors to introduce us to the sounds, the music, and the indelible impact of Eddie Harris on Chicago's music. And as an aside, I had the great fortune of being a fly on the wall as they exchanged ideas for this conversation, and the energy was palpable, and dare I say, electrifying. So please join me in welcoming Professors Travis Jackson and Adam Green.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think this is one of those moments where you say, the truly learned know the things that they don't know and are prepared to be open to learn. And, for me, having a sense of knowing Eddie Harris probably going back when I was a child and listening to Compared to What, which was charting in 1969, 1970 all across the radio, but over time, just coming to appreciate what an astoundingly open, generous, courageous musician and thinker and creator he was. And something that Pamela Shine said that, really appreciating the ways in which artistry rests in an embrace and a resolve to continue to evolve through your life and to continue to grow and continue to be open. I just feel like, going through the music, particularly thinking about different selections that came through powerfully. But Travis, you should start in terms of thinking about him in the context of this environment here.
Yeah, and thanks, Adam. One of the things that, I've been lucky enough to meet so many prominent performers over the years, and one of my great regrets is that I never got the chance to meet Eddie Harris, because everyone I know who met him, who talked to him, just, he's the kind of person I wish I could have even spent 5 minutes talking to. But I'm gonna sort of try to keep us on track. I'm gonna go through some notes that I wrote down for this, and as I think about his history, his development, one thing kept coming back to mind. There's probably an origin for this beyond what I know, that someone will correct me on before the day is done, but thinking about people like Eddie Harris and thinking about the environment from which he emerged, I can't help but think about the enormous role that the South Side of Chicago has played in the development of American music and culture, and worry about the number of South Side residents, current South Side residents of whatever backgrounds, who are not aware of that role. And so what comes to mind when I think about that is a line that I know from Bob Marley and the Wailers' 1979 song, Rat Race. In the abundance of water, the fool is thirsty. We're in the abundance of water. So I'm gonna focus here on the background, on what made the kind of work that Eddie Harris was able to do over his career possible. And no discussion of Black music making in Chicago in the 20th century would be complete without mention of DuSable High School. It opened in 1935 at 4934 South Wabash as New Wendell Phillips High School, but the name was eventually changed to Jean-Baptiste Pont DuSable High School in 1936. And that school looms large because of the music instructor and leader of bands, Walter Dyatt. He was a beloved and influential educator there. He's mentioned frequently in historical accounts, biographies, and all the histories of people who were performers and even those who weren't. As my colleague William Seitz observed, for example, many of the core members of Sunrise Orchestra were trained by Dyatt in music theory, harmony, instrumental performance, as well as punctuality, practice habits, and professional decorum.
Beloved and feared.
Yeah. Like Sunrise, and I'm quoting William Seitz here, he's in the audience. Like Sunrise former teacher Tess Watley of Birmingham, Dyatt was known as a tireless disciplinarian. And I'll give you an example of that in just a couple of moments. In fact, in another book about this area and this era, George E. Lewis's book on the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, he quotes Eddie Harris saying this about his time at DuSable. I remember one time I fell asleep. He kicked the chair out from under me. And I got up off the floor, my clarinet sprawled everywhere. After that quotation, Lewis commented, while continuing to quote Harris, "For Harris, Captain Walter Dyatt's methods, though seemingly a bit extreme, were necessary to instill discipline in young African Americans as a means of training them to cope with a hostile world. He had to be rough," Harris explained, "because the guys who came to that school were extremely rough. And he didn't tolerate that. He would either go upside your head or have you bring your parents to school." But Lewis goes on to observe why that high school and why music teachers in high schools at that point in time mattered so much. And Lewis says, quote, "Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, the formal musical education of most Black students ended after high school. So band teachers like Dyatt, and before him, N. Clark Smith, and their counterparts across the country were effectively responsible for most of the musical training these young men received, young women. It was by no means lost on these young people that universities or colleges other than historically Black institutions rarely hired even the most extensively educated African Americans as faculty. And one other way in which these musicians developed was in this broad network of venues that characterized the South Side, all along 63rd Street, up and down Cottage Grove. And Lewis, sorry about that. But for example, the Cotton Club, which was at 63rd and Cottage Grove, and it was formerly called the Little Club, it held nightly and sometimes daytime jazz sessions in the 1950s. And under the stewardship of more seasoned players like Von Freeman or Johnny Griffin, young players like Harris, alongside Clifford Jordan, Gene Ammons, Wilbur Ware, Willie Pickens, Andrew Hill, Jody Christian, all of those young musicians honed their skills playing in these sessions. George Lewis also mentions, via Muhal Richard Abrams, the importance of another venue in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the CNC Lounge at 63rd and Cottage Grove. And Harris was among the musicians there who workshopped ideas, eager to extend their knowledge and skills. And among the people who moved through there were people like Charles Stepney, the late Charles Stepney, Muhal Richard Abrams, Raphael Garrett, James Slaughter. And Harris says there were a small group of us on the same length in trying things. Not just sit down to play an Ellis Larkins run or a Duke Ellington run, we wanted to try different things. And so this space, the CNC Lounge, provided a minimal but absolutely vital infrastructure for the musicians. And one interesting thing is that as Harris's career took off and he was less around for those kinds of things, the musicians who remained there ended up forming the nucleus of what would go on to become the AACM. I'm going to wrap up here really quickly because we want to get to the things that Adam's going to talk about soon. But one other really important educator I want to mention, someone who I dearly miss, who was really important in welcoming me to Chicago about 23 years ago, was Richard Wang, who taught a number of musicians at Wilson Junior College here in town. And again, a number of those musicians went on to nurture other performers, many of them to become members of the AACM, but also these were people who formed part of the world that Harris continued to move in over the rest of his career. So a couple of other really quick notes, and then I will cede the floor to Professor Green. I believe in a number of ways that Eddie Harris is a figure who deserves to be revered alongside, to be held up alongside many other more prominently celebrated figures in the history of African-American music, jazz in the 20th century. People like Wayne Shorter, for example. And the reason why I say that is that his embrace of electronics, for example, and we'll hear a little bit about that in a couple of minutes, his desire to range across stylistic territory, not to be confined to any particular thing, these all set him apart in the same way that a figure like that Wayne Shorter, who deserves every accolade he has. But Harris, I think, deserves to be up there, to be thought about in the same sort of way. And one last thing I'll say really quickly, just as a way of understanding just how broadly engaged he was with a bunch of different musical things. He was, yes, of course, formed here in Chicago. He became famous and traveled all around the world, but there's this one interlude in the late 1960s when he was in LA. And one of the interesting things that came out of that interlude was that he was part of the jam sessions that Quincy Jones convened that ended up providing the music for the Bill Cosby Show that aired on ABC between 1969 and 1971. So if you've ever heard that theme for the show Hickey Burr, That horn player on there is Eddie Harris.
Thanks so much, Travis, for that in terms of thinking about the context in Chicago. I'm actually going to try to be DJ rather than analyst and just try to bring a few pieces of Eddie Harris's music together to exemplify what might be seen as some key themes in relation to thinking about his music. And I apologize in advance. They're going to be cuts that people dearly, dearly want to hear that won't come here. I've got 6 or 7 that I'm going to be playing. And they're themes that are going to be important and should be brought up in the course of the day, possibly in terms of some discussion after we're through, to just kind of remind people of the breadth of the way in which Eddie Harris touched and moved music forward. But I thought these themes might be helpful in terms of just really appreciating the power of his intervention and the ways in which he was able, to bring us. I think this is all right.
Okay. That way you don't have to hold it.
Oh, that's true. Okay. Yeah. No, I probably need to keep these fingers going in terms of moving these tunes over. Thank you, Travis. First of all, I think one of the things to say about Eddie Harris was that he was a polymath. He was a multi-genre musician. He was someone who really sort of thought in a incredibly ecumenical way about the totality of the musical landscape. And I think that's both in terms of what he performed and who he collaborated with, but in a way that I'm sort of beginning to learn from how he studied and how he kind of practiced himself into a position where he was able to speak so broadly to music over the course of the work that he did. And I have 2 pieces that I wanted to just bring up that I thought could kind of illustrate this. The first, of course, Eddie Harris at times received some criticism. His career started in terms of recording with the remaking of the theme of Exodus from the movie in the early 1960s. And quite unfairly, I think he was branded as someone who could kind of work the pop landscape as well as the jazz or serious music landscape. But, people, I think, never really, or I shouldn't say never, I think not enough people recognize the ways in which he had cred across all sorts of genres. And of course, one of them was just, not quite yet, straight ahead jazz. And the piece that I wanted to play was his recording, I think from the Excursions album in 1973, of the late, great Sonny Rollins' song Oleo. And this is a solo that's just him playing on the saxophone for about 2 minutes. chops. Man, definitely had chops. And, you know, the things that, I'm not a musician, but the things that people talk about in relation to what was unique, the dexterity in relation to working the saxophone, the ability to play at pace, you know, his sort of attention to note, chords, particularly the ways in which he thought about octave progressions in relation to being able to construct more and more elaborate solos was something that I think was very clear in that piece. And I think, as I'll talk about as we go through some of these selections, I think some of the ways in which you can see that credit validated is just the caliber of the people that played with him and the number of different people that sought to collaborate with him, that embraced sort of his lead in relation to assembling ensembles and putting together pieces. And so I thought about, well, if we've got that, what's a way to sort of think about, you know, something that goes to the other side of the spectrum in relation to showing the ways in which he was working different genres. And that could be blues, that could be funk, that could be maybe some of his comedy songs from the 1970s. But I thought a ballad would probably be the best way to think about moving in a somewhat different direction. And so I'm going to play now from Instant Death, an album that he had in 1972, a song Nightcap. And this song is interesting because it's just him and a guitarist. The guitarist is actually Ronnie Muldrow from here in Chicago playing with him. And it's quite a beautiful piece that kind of gives a sense of a very different sense of technique. So I'll go ahead and cue that up now. I think here he's using the baritone to modify the saxophone, which is something we'll talk about as we go a little bit further in. Yeah, we're going to be applauding a lot today. And there you just have a sense of a very different kind of range. And again, on this question of thinking about the genres, we could bring in so many different pieces, but we actually want to also get to conversation and ultimately the performance, which I think in some ways is the best tribute to the ways in which to think about his music. The next point is, and Travis touched on this a moment ago, is to think about Eddie Harris as what I would call a sonic innovator, as a sonic engineer. You know, somebody who was thinking about opportunities, particularly in the late 60s and early 70s, to kind of expand the horizons of sound. A lot of that had to do with electronic and amplifying technologies. A lot of it also had to do with the advent of synthesizers and the ways in which synthesizers began to both create opportunities to think about alternation in terms of different music, but something I taught a course on Stevie Wonder earlier this winter, and he was somebody who was a very important innovator and adapter in relation to this technology. Playing with synthesizers also allowed you to think about the quality of sound, almost at a physical level or at a level of physics, to think about the ways in which attack aspects related to the notes were something that could be shifted and changed by using electronic modification, the ways in which sustain, delay, reverb was something that could come in different sorts of ways, so that you were training ears to think in different sorts of ways about what they were encountering in relation to music. And my sense, I haven't seen people speak about this, that just intuitively in terms of his instinct and his kind of commitment towards experimentation, he was trying to think about different sorts of ways to train his own ears, to train the ears of his collaborators and people that he counted as his peers, and to train the ears of listeners to think in different sorts of ways about sounds. And so I have two pieces that I think speak to this. Again, we could have many, many that would kind of go in this direction. One is from the 1969 album Free Speech, and it's the first track, Wait Please. I should also say with that piece, the person on electric piano there is Jody Christian, who's come up a couple of times here. Jody Christian regularly played with Eddie Harris on many of his albums in the 60s and the 70s, and the kind of way in which their collaboration was something that was very important in terms of the quality of their music, I think is something that needs to be acknowledged. So I want to definitely, give thanks to those that worked with him as well as to Eddie Harris. You can also hear the baritone in terms of modifying the tone of the saxophone. This was an attachment that allowed echo, reverb, kind of shifting in relation to the timbre of the sound to be brought in terms of a reed instrument. Eddie Harris was also famous for having a reed adaptation in relation to the trumpet. And he also was in correspondence with Bob Moog, the creator of the Moog synthesizer. And they had a kind of very robust collaboration, and I think he designed a synthesizer unit that Eddie Harris used in the studio but was never commercially marketed. But Robert Moog remembers it in a bunch of interviews as a particularly innovative piece that he was able to put together and provide sort of bespoke to Eddie Harris as one of his musician collaborators. It was a 4 oscillator that allowed him to have different effects. And I believe that there's a song on Free Speech, if people are curious, called Bold and Black, which actually sort of brings in this effect about maybe a minute or a minute and 30 seconds into the song. But I want to shift to a different song, which is one that I did not know about until I was getting this list together, and it's an extraordinary, extraordinary piece, about 10, 11 minutes long. I really recommend it to anybody who wants to kind of see the experimental side of Eddie Harris come through. This is off of the Excursions album, again, the same one that had the Sonny Rollins Oleo song covered there. And this is Fragmentary Apparitions. And Fragmentary Apparitions is a really, really interesting piece where he's using multiple different horn players, a trombonist, couple of trumpet players, one other sax player, and then himself, and sort of bringing different figures together in terms of bass, electric piano, and horn work along with drums in order to kind of create this really interesting exploratory piece. I want to start, and I'm going to try to cue it up here. up to 8:48, if I can get to it. Yep, there we go. And this is after the song has progressed for about 8 minutes, 30 seconds, 8 minutes, 40 seconds. It breaks down into a sort of back and forth between the bassist using a kind of double or quadruple time figure that is mirroring the way that a trombone opened the song in relation to that same double or quadruple timed figure. And then Eddie Harris with his modified saxophone using the baritone to create these extraordinary tones. The bassist is either Melvin Jackson or Ron Carter. I can't sort of determine which of the two are playing on this, but this is Eddie Harris. So appropriate to the space and the occasion. And it just, reminds us thinking about the collaborators that worked with him, the vision that people kind of came in on. And it, I think, harkens back all the way to thinking about sitting in Diet's classroom or taking part in these workshops that eventually give birth to the AACM. Just this generosity of thinking about collaboration as generative. And again, the caliber of people that are playing with him, the ways in which they came back and worked with him, the ways in which they branched out into all sorts of different sound is really a testament to how they were able to do that. The drummer here, I should also say, is, Leon Ndugo Chancleer, who was also not only kind of important in relation to working with Harris, but was part of that early Mawandashi group that Herbie Hancock had that sort of moved his sound in a different direction. Another Chicagoan dedicated to evolution in relation to his musical work. And now the third theme, which is, some ways maybe the funnest theme. Eddie Harris sort of moved around all of these different areas. He was extraordinarily committed in terms of thinking about experimentation, but he was also a stone groove master. The guy knew how to lay down a beat, knew how to lay down tracks. And I think the ways in which, as I'll say in a moment, he's been embraced by people who have thought about the groove or the beat as the foundation of different generations of music is really important to kind of think about and look at. And again, we could come up with a lot of different songs in terms of being able to illustrate this. Listen Here, which is the sort of given us the theme for the event today, could have easily been the song. But I want to take a different song from the electrifying Eddie Harris from 1968, which is Sham Time. And Sham Time, I think, actually illustrates some of the ways in which he's thinking about a number of different rhythmic innovations that are taking place in the late 1960s. Jody Christen again on the piano. Amazing song in so many different ways. There were 5 different horn players, including King Curtis and Dave Fathead Newman, who were actually playing in back of Eddie Harris on that track. Melvin Jackson was doing bass. Did I hear right that Richard Smith was going to be here? Is Richard Smith here? No? Well, there was a possibility he was going to be here. He was the drummer in relation to that track. But also, and it's not credited, I haven't been able to kind of verify that this is the case, but I think it's probably the case. He was there for this recording session. Ray Barretto was doing percussion, and Ray Barretto, of course, did Watusi and I think Soul Drummers and several other songs that were part of the Boogaloo movement, and kind of basically this sort of confluence between Latin sort of forms and R&B as it was emerging during the late 1960s. And you can kind of feel that flavor coming through in relation to the track. Something that I think was actually an influence in relation to Harris and, helped kind of allow him to be able to create grooves that not only kind of moved across communities, but have moved through time. And this is the last of the songs that I want to play, which is from the Plug Me In album from 1968. This is a song called Lovely As Today, which I think is one of the most powerful, powerful grooves that he's done. People are already sort of giving rep in relation to it. And as I'll point out in a minute, it's something that people have picked up on in relation to thinking about hip hop and a number of other genres that come afterwards. This is Lovely in Today. One thing I'll just say as a kind of preview, you're gonna hear an acoustic bass, that's Ron Carter coming in on an intro, and then you're gonna hear an electric bass, that's Chuck Rainey, who was playing with Aretha Franklin, Steely Dan, a range of other people, Quincy Jones, and you really kind of hear the power of the groove that they're able to build. Richard Smith has an unbelievable, unbelievable kind of turn on the drums in relation to this song. Smoking. And I won't say anything more except to kind of point out the people who kind of picked this up and tried to work with it. Notably for me, something that comes from my youth, the rap group Gang Starr, who used this track on their Daily Operation album from 1992, DJ Premier did, for a song called Too Deep, which I'm going to play just a couple of minutes of. Why isn't it coming up? Huh. That is odd. Yeah, it might be. It's like going through all of the tracks and it's not actually playing it. Okay, well, take my word for it. And go over if you have like a Spotify or something and grab this track. And it's just a great example of bringing in jazz masters and then using them in relation to samples from James Brown, poly sort of layered rhythms, different pieces. Eddie Harris, I think, was sampled 170 times, according to the Who Sampled site. Everybody ranging from Pete Rock to the Jungle Brothers to Dillard, and then, of course, Gang Starr used his music. And I think that says something about the ways in which his appeal, his kind of influence not only ran broad, but it also ran deep in terms of kind of informing new generations of musicians to think in different sorts of ways about what they could do with the sonic palette, what they could do with the musical vocabulary, how they could think about being creative and exploratory in the same way that Harris is. So I just want to kind of give thanks and give tribute to the ways in which that music indeed, as several people have said before, lives on today. Do we have some time for some? No? Okay, we're going to have to go straight into the next side of this, but please keep listening to Eddie Harris, keep him alive, keep learning from him. Thank you very much.
Should I put up compared to what? Should I put up compared to what?
Okay.
I want to say it.
And
Travis wants to say something.
yeah, I just want to add one really, really quick thing. Any of you who want to support find any of this music, support any of the musicians, please, to the degree that you can, buy physical media. Don't use these streaming sites.
Fair enough.
Musicians make so little money from streaming websites, from Spotify, from Apple Music. Go buy their recordings, please. Okay.
Yep.